even professors, they ask us, how are you guys friends? Because we come from different planets. And I think the bond that we have is that Tim is obsessed with this Lebanese traditional dance, our dabki. He's so obsessed by it that he wants to learn it and master that dance.
And Tim is not just good in Lebanese dancing, he's got his moves for Bollywood dancing as well. He came to my wedding in December and he was one of the biggest sort of attractors of the whole crowd, and everyone was like, oh my god, this guy has got the moves. So yeah, very, very multi-talented.
And one last thing before Tim starts presenting. I mean, I've never seen anyone as stubborn and as dedicated and passionate about what he does in terms of research and discrete choice, and trying to push the field forward in terms of accuracy and prediction as Tim.
And we're so excited to introduce him and hear about his exciting work.
All right, let's hear it for Tim.
Can we ask questions from the opening up?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Shrita, and for us for the nice introduction. And for the rest of everyone here, I guess we'll jump straight into the presentation. So I think pretty much everyone was around, and all the people watching as well, were around the 1990s when I think the phrase "more money, more problems" became a big hit of a phrase. And within city planning and transportation engineering, there's a similar and growing sort of acknowledgement of the fact that with more cars come more problems. And in particular, what you find is that you have more traffic collisions, more traffic fatalities, greater amounts of pollution, greater amounts of congestion. All these things come along with more cars and greater amounts of driving. And so one governmental response to all of this has been to increase the amount of people biking. And governments really at every level, from federal down to the local level, have sort of picked up on this as a thing to do. However, they haven't been all that successful. And this is, again, at every level of government, they haven't been that successful. So to take some local examples, in California and more locally at the city of Oakland, there were goals for 2010, multi-year goals, of trying to reach 1.2% and 4%. And in neither case, even by 2014, years after the original goal date had been set, none of these agencies had met their goals for their multi-year targets. And I don't say this to pick on California at all, because really this pattern repeats across the entire country. But it's sort of emblematic of the fact that there's really still quite a lot of work to be done. And one of the reasons that you might have issues trying to meet your multi-year goals is that there's limited funding for bicycle-related projects and bicycle planning in this country. And along with limited funding and limited political will, you have a need for strategic investments in bicycle infrastructure. If you don't have a lot of money, then you have to be smart about where you put it. So to this extent, there's probably a very good example from the very recently adopted, as in a couple weeks ago, adopted City of Berkeley bicycle plan. In there, you can see that one of the main things that they look at when they're evaluating what sort of projects to prioritize and to push forward is what's highlighted in yellow, which is a demand analysis. And a demand analysis looks at what's the effect on the bicycle usage and the amount of cyclists that you expect to have as a result of some bicycle-related project. How do you best evaluate the effects of a project on bicycle demand? And to this extent, probably a gold standard might be the use of a travel demand model. Whereas, although maybe academics and many of us might think that a travel demand model is best for this, it's clear from what goes on with many practitioners that if you speak to them, that they don't consider everything that glitters to be gold. Travel demand models are really not used all that frequently when it comes to trying to evaluate the effect of a project on bicycle demand. And a couple of the reasons why might be that people don't consider it sufficiently tailored enough to the needs of bicycle planning. And perhaps they don't consider it terribly accurate as well. And if you ask me, I might actually agree with you and say that in this situation, for the purposes of bicycle planning, the emperor really doesn't have any clothes in this case. And part of the reasons why are the following. One, traditional travel demand models currently exclude lots of variables that are considered very relevant for bicycle planning. On top of this, they all make assumptions that you might also consider questionable in the context of people choosing whether or not to bike or to not bike. And lastly, all current travel demand models, they ignore the statistical effects that come from having low numbers of cyclists relative to the other travel modes in one's data set. So given that these are some of the issues, you can imagine that that's what I focused on in my PhD. In particular, to address the issue of the omission of relevant roadway variables, what I did was developed a concept called the zone of likely travel, and combined it with a concept from machine learning known as decision trees to incorporate these variables that we consider relevant. In addition, I developed a thing called a tree-based Gaussian process model, which is, again, combining decision trees from machine learning and combining what are known as Gaussian process models from statistics. And also, I realized none of these words may mean anything just yet. It's fine. In the rest of the presentation, we'll go through each of them very slowly, without any jargon, and hopefully with nice pictures to explain what in the world I'm talking about. And finally, I developed a set of asymmetric choice models and ways to create such things that address the sort of statistical implications of having low numbers of cyclists. So I guess if there's one thing that I would like you all to take away and remember from this talk, and I guess in the words of my parents who are all from Panama, it would be that sí se puede, which is that yes we can, yes it can be done, in the sense of you can increase the policy relevance and accuracy of bicycle demand models at the same time. By changing the way that you build and estimate these models, you can have some hope for some progress, for some change, even if you don't remember any of the specifics that come later. So, as an outline, we're first going to talk about what's a model. We're going to step really all the way back and go through just what do I mean by a model in the first place that might be foreign to some. Then we'll talk about how one can incorporate the sort of variables that are deemed to be relevant for bicycle planning. We'll then talk about how you model traveler irrationality in decision making, and then we'll discuss how do you model a minority mode. After all of this, we'll have a brief recap where I focus on the so what of it all at the end of the day, and then a couple of brief comments about what's next after all of it. Okay, so what goes into a model? Really, I'd say it's like three things, or at the bare minimum. You have a set of inputs, which typically for travel demand models are social demographics. This is things like age, gender, income, household structure. You have things like the level of service for various travel modes. This is travel costs, travel times. And then you have the math of it all. I'll, for the moment, call that like the secret sauce in the middle. It's just a mapping between the inputs that you give and the outputs that you're interested in, which in many cases refer to the probability that an individual travels by any one of the particular modes that are available. And we'll come back to the middle about the math, but for the moment, what I want to focus on is the inputs to these models, and in particular, what you might consider to be missing. At no point earlier did I mention bike lanes, bike paths, wayfinding signs, traffic volumes, traffic speeds, topography, is it hilly or not. All these things are thought to have a very serious impact on the probability that a person bikes, and they are almost never incorporated into travel demand models. To be fair, there have been some previous attempts to incorporate these factors that are thought to be very important into the actual demand models. And I'll go through a couple of those previous approaches now. First, there's the use of what are called buffer-based methods. This is you take an individual's origin, you take their destination, you draw a buffer, which is just a geographic area, typically a circle of some radius, around these 2 points. And then you go and you look at all the roadways that are contained within these buffers, and you say, okay, well, for each roadway, do they have a bike lane on it? What's the traffic flow on it? What's the traffic volume on it? What's the traffic speed? What's the grade? You go through all of these variables that you consider relevant, and you calculate them for every roadway in the buffer. You then aggregate those values up from the roadway level to the level of the buffer itself by taking averages or taking percentiles or some method of getting back to, for every one of those variables, one value for each buffer. And then you take those values and you place them again into your typical travel demand model. A second and complementary method that has been used in the past is the use of bicycle environment factors. And here the idea is to not simply take the aggregated values of those variables you care about and incorporate them. It's to come up with a score for the entire region of interest, let's say, for instance, the buffer. And then from these, or you might score the individual roadways. Either way, you're going to come up with a score for the entire zone, and this score is then going to go into your travel demand model. And the interpretation is that this score is essentially related to some quality about bicycling, how good is the environment for it. The third approach that's been used in the past is to make use of route choice models. And here, this is actually the approach to even use in San Francisco, for instance. The idea is that instead of coming up with a score for every single roadway, you come up with a score for every possible route between an individual's origin and destination. You can imagine, for those of you who are discrete choice people, you can imagine you have the utility for every single route that a person derives, and then you aggregate up from every route to look at overall how good is the bicycling environment, the expected maximum utility over all of the possible routes. And you enter that, again, into your mode choice model at the end. So this is what's been done before, and you might wonder it seems like a lot, why do we continue and do anything else? And that's really because there's still a couple of problems with what's been done before. The first is that with buffer-based approaches, you include a lot of streets that may not actually matter. If a person's traveling between the shown home and the shown workplace destination, the streets that are not in between their home and work probably don't matter that much for whether or not they bike. Those on the streets they're going to be traveling on. And at the same time, your buffer usually of some not humongous radius is going to miss a lot of streets in between their home and work, which you might think that will impact whether or not they choose to bike. And you've completely disregarded them. So this is one reason buffer-based methods don't seem to be the end-all, be-all, and we would feel the need to do more. Continuing further, if you look at bicycle environment factors, typically the way they're built is you have a lot of very well-intentioned professionals and experts who get around and they say, okay, how important are each of these variables for a person biking? It's well-intentioned, but it's still a completely subjective exercise, really. At the end of the day, it's not based on the data at hand that they have in front of them, the way that they come up with these scores. And then even in approaches where they try to have objective measures of building these bicycle environment factors, those are typically in the past been based on things like factor analysis, which I won't go much into the details, but they have a reputation of being uninterpretable. So clearly we need some sort of a method that is both interpretable and based on data that we have in front of us. And finally, with the route choice model, here, most route choice models that are built, especially if they are done with the purpose of integrating with a mode choice model afterwards, are built on what's called revealed preference data. This is individuals who are actually biking, who are traveling around. And if that's the case, then all of the sensitivities that you've just estimated in your route choice model are only based on people who are biking. And then you have to implicitly assume that the people who are not biking have the same sensitivities as the people who are biking. And then you extrapolate from there, which I think many of us might see this as a unreasonable assumption. The person who's out there on their road bike, who's like the spandex warrior going to school now, really probably does not have the same sensitivities as the person who might bike around on their cruiser from home to work, or the person who might not hop in a car at all, or who might not hop on a bike at all and would only drive. So we would like to avoid these sorts of assumptions as well. So with all these problems, what I set out to do was to say, can I take the good portions of all of these approaches, combine them in some way while avoiding the sorts of issues that we've seen? And the way that I thought of doing this is by first introducing this thing called a zone of likely travel. The way to think of this is take a shortest path between an individual's origin and destination. Draw your buffer around the shortest path. Don't draw it around their origin and destination. And the width of this buffer, how far out you go, is also derived based on empirical data. In particular, we looked at data on how far individuals are willing to deviate from their shortest path, and given the length of that shortest path. And the idea is to say, while I may not know exactly what roadway you bike on, you're probably likely to bike on some road in this zone when you're going from your origin to your destination. The point being that we'll then be able to capture not just the characteristics of roadways around your origin and destination, but also in between. So at this point, you go through every roadway, and it's very similar to the buffer-based approach where you calculate the variables you care about on every roadway, you then aggregate them up to the level of the zone, and now we want, again, similar to a bicycle environmental factor approach, we want some sort of score. Some sort of score or variable that's going to indicate what's the quality of bicycling in this zone, or what's the quality of this zone for bicycling. Here, we take an approach based on the use of decision trees. And these trees are estimated completely based on data of individuals who are either traveling or not traveling. For instance, this particular tree was estimated on around 630 or so individuals making commute choices in Oakland, San Francisco, and Berkeley. And not everyone bikes, so the relationships that you see don't represent just people who are biking. It's also people who are not biking. And for every individual, you calculate their zone of likely travel, you calculate all these variables for them, you calculate aggregates of these roadway variables, like averages, percentiles, ranges, things like this. And then you get something that looks like this, where the way to interpret it is, if you're traveling a very far way, greater than 4 miles, regardless of anything else, not many people bike. We had 6 out of 130 in this case biking. If you are traveling a short distance, or a relatively short distance, less than 4 miles, and your slope, the average slope across all roadways in the zone is very high, like the grade is approximately 12%. Again, not many people biked. Now, if you are traveling a short distance and not having to travel in a zone that has a very high slope, now you look at what are the bike lanes, what's the percentage of roadways in this zone that have bike lanes on them. If it was a moderately high amount, like greater than 11%, actually a substantial amount of people biked in this case. However, even if it wasn't that high, still, just because of the fact that you're not traveling far and you're not traveling up high grades, still a fair amount of people biked, although less than when you have lots of bike lanes. So at this point, what you have is these four nodes here, this one, and the 2 above, the output nodes, they're essentially descriptors of conditions. And these descriptors of conditions come along with values that tell you how much do people bike, or how much do people like to bike when they're in these conditions. So we create indicator variables, or dummy variables, for every one of these nodes, and those indicator variables now go into our traditional travel demand model, and we proceed it as usual. So what's the effect of all this? The effect of all this is the following. Here we're looking at how we predict either the probability or the actual choice of an individual cycling. And when I say the probability of the choice, I mean the average correct probability. For those of you coming from a more discrete choice background, this is a one-to-one transformation of the log likelihood. You can think of it this way. For those of you coming from more of a machine learning background, where I don't care about the probabilities, tell me did they bike, did they not bike, that's shown on the right, under the accuracy heading. And at this point, no matter which sort of metric you're looking at, you can do better. And this is out of sample, not even on the sample in front of you, but when predicting people you haven't seen, you do better with this sort of method. So to summarize the contributions from this first part of the presentation, by combining this zone of likely travel with the decision tree process afterwards, I demonstrated that it's both feasible and it's beneficial to incorporate roadway level variables into your travel demand model. We don't have to settle for not including them. And it's not even a terribly long process either. In addition to this, there's increased sensitivity to the roadways that are between one's origin and destination, at least relative to a buffer-based approach, which didn't include them at all, period. They weren't even there. And then on top of this, when you compare to a bicycle environment factor approach, we systematically and in an interpretable fashion, like anyone can read a decision tree quite easily and know what's going on, combined these roadway level variables into some sort of overall measure of the quality of this environment for bicycling. And also we managed to do all this without having to necessarily make as stringent assumptions as you do in a about choice model case. Okay. So now we're going to move on to looking deeply into what goes on in the math of all of these models. In other words, what goes into this secret sauce that I alluded to earlier and didn't actually talk about. And one of the first things I'm going to mention is that behind all the math of all these travel demand models is a set of behavioral assumptions about how people make decisions and how they behave. One of the foremost assumptions that really undergird everything that gets done for the most part in travel demand modeling is that humans are these perfectly rational actors. The so-called Homo economicus, this like rational man who can weigh every one of the attributes that describe the various travel modes and then trade them off against each other such that this person can find the mode that offers them the highest utility and then choose it. And I would maintain that this Homo economicus, kind of like Bigfoot, is a myth. That you don't have people who are perfectly rational at all times. Really, you have people that, sure, in some situations are very rational. In other situations, if it rains too much, I don't bike. You know, it doesn't matter whatever else is going on with this mode, with any of the attributes of the mode, I don't care. I say, man, I don't want to get too wet. I mean, not me personally, but maybe my sister, let's say, because I bike. Yeah, but a lot of people, they make decisions like this. And so again, we find ourselves coming to this sort of if-then decision-making, as to take one particular example of so-called irrational decision-making habits, where here, just as an example, again, if it's raining, person doesn't bike. If the travel time is short and it's not raining, then maybe they're likely to bike. However, if the travel time is long, even though it's not raining, and they have to go up a lot of hills, again, they don't bike. But if it's flat, however they have to travel a long way, maybe they're unlikely to bike. So at this point, what you get is motivated from really economic considerations of how people make decisions, you arrive again at this sort of decision tree structure that before was just a convenient way to describe the set of roadway variables in one zone. And even though we're approaching this from the perspective of people who are not being completely rational in their decision making, in these two cases where someone's either likely to bike or unlikely to bike, there are still other variables that might, push an individual to say, oh no, I'm actually going to bike, regardless of what my probability is, or not. So you might imagine that people are some mix of both rational and irrational. Perhaps they are irrational in creating their consideration set, that is the set of alternatives that they consider. But once they've considered these variables, perhaps now they actually undertake a more detailed thought process about, okay, now that I'm going to consider all these alternatives, which one do I choose? So this leads to wanting to combine both some measure of an irrational decision-making process with the traditional travel demand models that we've been using already, which are all based on very rational actors. One key difference, though, from what we were doing before and what's going on now is that, or the interpretation of these models before and now, is that if I'm talking about people making decisions, people are super complex, and it's very, very hard to know exactly what someone is doing or what someone is thinking. So the idea is that you absolutely have to account for uncertainty in the sort of if-then rules that you might estimate from data. Before, we had a single tree. We estimated. We said, great. We ran with it and used it. Whereas now the idea is, if I'm going to try to give this interpretation of a tree representing some sort of decision-making process, you shouldn't be so prideful. You should maybe say, step back and go, all right, how do I account for the fact that maybe this tree isn't the correct one? And in doing so, you arrive at this sort of, what I described before as this tree-based Gaussian process model. Tree-based in the sense that you use a lot of trees, like a forest of trees, to represent uncertainty in the if-then decision rules that people are using. And the Gaussian process part of it comes from the fact that given a tree, the effect of each if-then rule, in other words, the effect of each node that you might be in the tree, is definitely unique. Each node has a different preference for biking. However, you might think that they're all drawn from a common distribution. And it's not critical that it be a Gaussian, but it's very convenient, hence the Gaussian process in the name. Okay, so that was a lot of talk to describe what in the world is going on, and we have some results, albeit preliminary results, because this is actually still ongoing work. It's the last thing that I'm finishing. But still, the preliminary results are kind of interesting. The first is that even when you're looking at only people who own a bicycle, if you look at the y-axis in terms of the probability of considering bike, no one's at 100. So the typical assumption in travel demand models is that if you own a bike, then you're definitely considering a bike. You're definitely considering it. We find that that's not the case. Granted, it's very high, but it's not 100. Just because you own a bike, you don't necessarily consider it. More so when we looked across the population and we said, wow, there was this group of people who seem to have a lower probability of considering bicycle as compared to others. When I started looking into why, I was like, oh, they all have a lot of kids. As in, if you had more than 2 kids, your probability of even considering bike, regardless of whether or not you own one, was lower, which is quite intuitive. And as a matter of fact, everyone who had more than 2 kids, none of them actually biked, regardless of whether or not they considered it. 0 of them actually biked, which has some sort of implications for when you're talking about where should I place bike lanes, and you're looking around at the demographics of the people in the areas where you're either placing them or placing them between if you're looking at origin destinations. Either way, you should consider who might be using these lanes. A more unexpected result was the following, though. This was looking at what's the probability that a given individual, if they consider bike, is influenced by the bicycle infrastructure in the area. And here, what I found was that, at least according to the model results so far, less than the majority of people had a 50% or less chance of actually being influenced by the bicycle infrastructure in the area. If you think back to the picture of the tree I showed you before, perhaps they just live far away. It doesn't matter what happens afterwards. Perhaps they just live in an area that's very hilly and they're like, man, I don't want to sweat on my way to work. They don't care about what happens afterwards. For lots of reasons, somewhat of a somber point, but I think we should be aware that when you come in and attempt to change bicycle infrastructure, hoping to increase bicycling, you, I think, have to pay a lot of attention to what's even the chance that the people in this area are going to be influenced by the bicycle infrastructure. And this is not something that's easily done by just eyeballing things and saying, all right, here's who lives here. There's quite a lot of, I guess, analysis work that needs to go behind those sorts of judgment calls. Moreover, I think a picture like this points to the need for a greater land use transportation connection. Like, you need to get people living closer to where they work. We can't just rely on bike infrastructure to sort of be the band-aid that solves all these things, for instance. Okay, so to summarize what went on here in this second part of the presentation, it's that I developed a method to flexibly account for irrationality of travelers when they're making decisions. And I say flexibly just because of the fact that in the previous literature that's tried to account for irrational decision making, none of them would allow for this sort of like nested decision process of, okay, if not A and not B, then okay, here's my result. Nothing before would ever do such a thing. This is really like the first time that you get such a complete picture of the various levels at which people are making irrational decisions. And these sort of models, they paint a richer picture than we had previously of who considers biking and what's the effect of bicycle infrastructure on these individuals given that they consider biking. So taking a step back and looking even broader than just at bicycling in particular, this work was merging decision trees from machine learning as a method with Gaussian process models from statistics as a method with traditional travel demand models. And what this all does is sort of clarifies the economic meaning and implications of using a decision tree model, which lots of people in the travel demand world, I think, would be very wary about using such techniques before, because there wasn't some sort of interpretation that they could readily latch onto. This work makes such an interpretation clear, and it provides a link between choice models that are used in transportation and these models used in other literatures. Okay, so last part is the fact that cyclists are minority mode. There's not a lot of them. And to put up really just a picture, there's like, less than 2% of people biking, for instance, in California as a whole, as compared to other modes. And while it's clear from graphs like this, it's not taken into account so far really in any of the travel demand models that I've seen thus far. There's been some work in in stats, in machine learning, to say, hey, what happens when I have a low number of people doing something? The so-called class imbalance problem. But there, the focus is almost always on, simply on, how can I patch up my models to have better predictions, without ever saying, are my models even explaining the phenomena correctly in the first place? And that's something we wanted to look at here. So for those who wonder, no cyclist, no problem, it's not a big deal, it's not really the case. There's been a fair amount of work showing that when you have a low number of observations using one alternative, then what you get is increased bias, increased finite sample bias, to be super specific, in the parameters that you estimate. You get increased bias in the predicted probabilities, even in sample, of that mode. And then when you try to look out of sample and you look at your predictive performance, that as well decreases when you have a high imbalance between the number of people using some mode or some alternative versus the other alternatives. And so given that, I wasn't the first person to see such a problem, I then look around and I say, well, great, what did other people do first before I reinvent the wheel or something? And what I find is the following. In sometime around, in 1999, you get the first paper coming out of really quite a long series of papers in the statistics literature saying, hey, if I have a low number of observations in some category or some alternative, then perhaps this means that the rate at which people take up that alternative is not the same as the rate at which people abandon that alternative. In other words, the rates of increase and decrease are not necessarily the same. In other words, your probability function may not be symmetric. The curve shown in white corresponds to the sort of model that we use all the time in travel demand analyses. It's a perfectly symmetric curve. What you get in this first paper is the introduction of asymmetric probability functions, where again, if you look from 50% and go up, or from 50% and go down, they don't go up and down at the same rates. So there's been a lot of work, let's say, in fraud detection, in people looking at earthquakes. There's been a lot of work in any of these areas where the number of people using one mode or having one outcome is not the same as the other, but they've all been limited or excluded from the transportation law. And so I wonder why. And one of the first things I see is that every single time one of these papers comes out, and there are a lot of them where they have a slightly different asymmetric probability function than the ones before. But these probability functions seem to arise magically, drop from thin air, with no discussion of where did the function come from, how did you derive it, how did you create it. And for people who are, for transportation people who are very theory driven, and it's I don't think in general, culturally, they do well with things that might work empirically well, but have no sound theoretical basis. They don't adopt these things. So this was one issue we saw. The second, and which I think was quite a bit more fundamental, is the following. All of these papers in the statistics literature focused on two alternatives only. And when you're looking at travel demand and people making decisions of how to travel from one place to another, it's inherently dealing with many alternatives. Someone bikes, or they walk, or they drive, or they take train, or they take the bus, or they take Uber or Lyft, or they hop on their scooter, all sorts of things go on. And it's really non-trivial to go and extend any of these models from the binary case where you have two alternatives to the case where you have many. And these are two of the biggest issues that I saw preventing the use of these models that worked well in other places from transportation. So what I did in this section of the work was that I created a systematic way to create new binary, or to create asymmetric choice models that deal with two alternatives. Essentially, all you need to provide me with is how you are going to judge the predictions of said model. So in other words, in very technical speak, if you give me a loss function, I hand you back a probability function. And this is not a very high bar to be passed. I feel like people can tell you, all right, this prediction is wrong by this much, and here's the penalty for it. And once you have such a binary asymmetric model, I also provided an algorithm that will immediately generalize it to the case of multiple alternatives, thereby addressing these two sorts of issues that I saw existing before. And as proof of concept, I created 4 different asymmetric models as example. as examples, 2 of them which generalized existing binary asymmetric models, and 2 that created them completely from scratch. And just to show that it can be done. And so then what are the results of all this? So here we're using a different data set than before. We're using the entire 9-county Bay Area with many more travelers than before. Additionally, we're not making use of these specific roadway level variables that we talked about before, because gathering the data across the 9 counties was hard. But so it's really just looking at what happens when I change the symmetry and you estimate it from the data of the probability functions you have. And here, again, you see that, sure, there's some small, but prevalent and like repeated increase in accuracy, again. However, to me, I thought that the biggest change that came from using these models was not the increase in accuracy. It was really the sort of fundamental change in the story that gets told by each of these stories. Here's an example. So a couple weeks ago, Faraz got up and gave his dissertation talk about how people adopt modes that lead to lots of driving. I tend to really not like talking about people adopting driving, and I would much rather talk about people abandoning driving. So here what you see is the estimated probability functions, one being from the uneven logit model, which is one of those that I created, and the other being from the traditional logit model that's used all the time. And so I looked and said, all right, let me take a person who has an 80% chance of driving in each case, hence the 2 dots on the upper right-hand side. And then I said, great, let me increase the cost of driving by $1 per mile. In the case of the traditional travel demand modeling, probability of driving plummets to about 2% immediately. That's the cost shown, that's the probability shown in the dot all the way on the left-hand side. If you look at what happens in the uneven logit model, you don't see a second dot. The reason? They're almost on top of each other. It went from 80% to 79.97%. Change is very small, given the same increase in the cost of driving. And the sort of story being told here is that for people who have a very high probability of driving, they are very slow to abandon this mode. You have to do a lot to push a person out of their car and into another mode. And this is something you don't find coming out when you look at the sort of models that have been used so far. However, if that person has a more moderate probability of driving, let's say around 60%, sure, increase the cost of driving by $1 per mile, it plummets again to about the same level as you saw before. So in other words, what you get is a more detailed picture of how the probability of using these other modes change as a result of changing the factors that go into a person's mental calculation about whether or not I drive, whether or not I bike, or something like this. The relations to biking, basically when you look at so-called stick policies, where if you imagine a carrot and a stick, sometimes I do things that aren't directly to increase aren't directly to improve the conditions of biking. It's to make the other travel modes look less attractive. For instance, I might say, hey, this entire area is going to be a car-free zone. In other words, your travel time, if you drive, is going to increase because you must park somewhere outside and walk in, or do something else. Here shown is the first car-free zone in Utrecht in the Netherlands, for example. Or if you look at congestion pricing, which has been talked about even again recently in San Francisco, that would increase the cost of driving. What you get is, I guess, a perhaps more realistic picture of how these increases in costs in travel time are going to lead people to move away from let's say, driving. And perhaps it lets you know when you need to be more aggressive than what you were thinking of before to have the effects that you want. So, to wrap everything up, what are the key takeaways from the overall dissertation and the work that I've done? The first is that it is possible, and you should, thoughtfully include roadway level variables in the travel demand models that you're doing, if you want them to be useful for biking, for bicycle planning at all. The second is that you probably should model the irrationality of people when they're making travel mode choice decisions. And the third is that you should allow for asymmetric patterns of adoption and abandonment of various travel modes, as opposed to assuming that they're all the same, which is what's been done so far. So, okay. Now you ask yourself, are we ready to go? We got it, we're done, let's go out there, build all the things. And the sort of cautionary answer to that is, not yet. Hold your horses. One of the things that you might consider that we haven't touched yet is issues of causality. And here is this very tongue-in-cheek phrase that, no causation without manipulation. In other words, if you want to estimate an effect that says, as a result of this policy intervention, then something else will happen afterwards, it's not good enough to just estimate these correlational measures that you get from the data that we have. And there are very specialized techniques that allow you to do so. I did not use any of them in this work in my dissertation, and they are not used currently in travel demand modeling out there. We should change this. That's probably some big work that should be done. The second thing is that we should optimize. What's the use of a model if I can't come in and say, great, given a functioning model, where best should I put my limited resources? I have a budget for a city, where should I put the bike lanes to get the most people biking? As far as I've seen, there's not been any work done anywhere, ever, on treating this sort of optimization problem. It's a big one, and I think should hopefully be worked on by some of you saying for PhDs afterwards, later. Finally, there are already existing techniques that will try to cater for differing amounts of consideration. In other words, who considers what travel modes when they travel? And also, given that you consider these modes, how much do you prefer them across the population? They already exist, and for instance, the latent class models or the modality style models coming out of the same research group that I'm in with Joan, with Faraz, with these people, they have different sort of motivations and economic assumptions behind them, but it would be quite useful to see how do they compare against each other? When is one more useful than the other? Can they be combined? Should they be? All of this sort of work I think would be quite valuable and remains to be done and is on the future agenda. So, with all that, thanks for listening, everyone. So I have a couple of acknowledgements.